Francesco Rizzuto is the Dean of the School of Law at Liverpool Hope University and joins us live from the UK. So, Francesco, 9 hours of talks between Russia and Ukraine in Berlin, leading to nothing. Did you expect something to come out of this?
No. Good afternoon, by the way. No, very difficult. Look, something came out of it, and that is that the Russians and the Ukrainians are talking, and actually they've agreed to continue to talk, of course, with the Germans and the French next month. Which I guess, if you're an optimist, you would say, oh, that means there's not going to be an invasion. Well, I never thought there'd be an invasion in any event. Perhaps I'm an optimist. So I didn't expect anything to come out of it. Why? Because the Ukrainians and the Russians disagree fundamentally about what to do next in the Donbass. That's the issue. The Russians want an election first, and the Ukrainians want the Russian military or pseudo-military to give up their arms and withdraw before they have an election. So when you have that kind of gridlock, it's extremely difficult.
Yeah, I mean, it's years long now, so it's hard to imagine one more round.
8 years.
Yes. Okay, so what we're hearing from the U.S. is, again, top officials returning to this rhetoric that an invasion could happen any day now, even while the Olympics are going on. How much of that do you think is just a warning and pressure to Russia, and how much is it a real belief that Russia is going to do something militarily?
Well, I think it's difficult to know exactly what the American administration is really thinking. However, this is actually a very clever tactic, because what they're doing is making transparent what their intelligence people are picking up. They're giving it a particular spin. So it's actually quite effective in the sense that it's telling the world, this is what you may be doing. This is what we think you're doing. But remember, the Ukrainians are really very irritated by this, and they've made it clear that they're irritated by Biden calling American citizens to leave. A, because it exposes the poor Ukrainians. If there are no Americans, well, the Russians may be more susceptible to walk in. So they're not too keen on this kind of grandstanding, and this is what the Ukrainians consider this. They want Western support. But Western support does not mean that the Westerners or the Brits and the Americans pack their bags and leave, because that would expose them. So it's not a great move, though the tactic of opening up the files, if you like, the intelligence files and what they suspect the Russians are doing as a way of almost inhibiting the Russians is useful. It is useful. But the reality is that the Russians actually don't need to invade in order to destabilize and make life very, very difficult for the Ukrainians and the Ukrainian government. Would you invest in the Ukraine with this kind of problem, with a threat of a Russian invasion? If you're a Ukrainian, how much longer is this going to go on for? What about the economy? What about energy and so on? So you don't even have to effect a coup. You simply keep the pressure up, and there will be movement within the Ukraine over time. So the Russians mustn't overplay their hand. But actually, as a strategy, and I'm not condoning this, by the way, as a strategy, it's actually quite clever. You know, people have underestimated Putin. They really have. It's a very clever way without necessarily firing a shot. Certainly in a full-scale invasion.
Definitely.
So it's not so crazy.
So Francesco, we've seen this back and forth in proposals/demands between Russia and the West. We're waiting for Russia to respond to proposals from NATO and the United States. I mean, it's been said by many that Putin, of course, knows that his initial demands of keeping Ukraine out of NATO forever and so on are just no-goes. He never would expect that. So what do you envision in these proposals would satisfy Putin at this point and get him to end this?
Well, I think an overall agreement in terms of security in Europe, without a doubt, and some kind of commitment that the Ukraine would not join NATO. I know that that's an extremely difficult thing for NATO to accept, but realpolitik, Russia will find it extremely difficult to accept that the Ukraine, just as it found it impossible to accept that Georgia, for example, was going to join NATO, which would have actually got NATO into a war with Russia. But let's not go there. So I think that there will have to be an agreement on a boundary, if you like, that NATO will not go beyond. The diplomats will have to find a way of formulating that. Though I noticed today that actually one of the individuals, Helmut Kohl's advisor, claims that NATO never promised that they wouldn't go to the Russian borders. But this is just playing games of something very, very silly. Or the other thing that might be acceptable to Putin, though I don't see it myself, is that the Ukraine becomes like Finland was, a sort of neutral country. But of course, people forget the history of the relationship between Finland, Nazi Germany as was, and the Soviet Union that resulted in Finland becoming neutral. So it's not a good comparison. And in any event, the Ukraine as a sort of de jure state that is neutral is not really sustainable. The Ukrainians wouldn't necessarily wear that in any event. So I think it has to be a comprehensive agreement on a new security architecture in Europe. That is the only way forward, really. But if I can add this, I think that Putin is a very, very sharp, clever guy. He's been described as an opportunist and so on, but he understands strength and he knows weakness. And I think the way we've handled this in the West has either been clever in some quarters and subtle, but really, you want to, I know it's a high-risk thing, and I thought I was a little crazy in calling for this in my social media account the other day. Look, if you really want to be serious about showing Putin that we mean business, don't send 350 soldiers or even 1,000. Send 250,000, match him without going into the Ukraine. That may sound crazy, but history has taught us over the last 20 or 30 years, with the collapse of certain states in Eastern Europe, for example, the former Yugoslavia, that in the end, strength has to be matched by strength. You don't necessarily have to start shooting. And the second way of dealing with this, of course, is that invest in the Ukraine. Don't offer Ukraine NATO membership, but incorporate Ukraine far more than we've done now into the European Union without necessarily becoming a member of the European Union.
Okay, Francesco, let's leave it there. But it's always good to hash this out with you. I really appreciate it. Thank you.